Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. Our guest today is Greg Love, and our topic is sexual abuse prevention. Greg, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Happy to be here, Todd.
Greg Love is a recognized expert in legal standards of care related to child sexual abuse, and he's passionate about equipping ministry leaders with an understanding of sexual abuse issues facing the church, litigating sexual abuse cases across the United States. His unique perspective provides valuable counsel to high-profile clients while also providing crisis response to ministries and churches nationwide. In addition to creating loss control resources for insurance companies, Greg regularly trains underwriting and risk management professionals to assess sexual abuse risk. After decades of litigating sexual abuse cases and providing legal counsel to ministries, Greg partnered with Dallas Theological Seminaries to create the first ever seminary course addressing the risk of child sexual abuse in ministry context. Greg is founder of Ministry Safe and Abuse Prevention Systems, along with his wife, Kimberly Norris, 2 decades ago. Greg and Kimberly have one child, and they live in Texas and have been practicing law together for over 20 years. Greg is the featured trainer for Kentucky Baptist upcoming church prepared training. So let's jump right into these questions. Greg, sexual abuse has been an unfortunately prevalent topic in recent Southern Baptist life. What are some of the challenges that churches face on this issue?
Well, churches face a lot of challenges, and we get to see that in a different way than most people do, because at Ministry Safe, we're taking calls from folks that are asking questions. We're taking calls from folks that are in crisis. And so there's some common patterns to those questions. And most of those questions come from a standpoint of, I just don't understand the risk. And so what we try to do is help people understand that there are some challenges to this, because sexual abuse risk is not intuitive. It's not something that we're going to accidentally get this right. So oftentimes ministry leaders are waking up to this because they have a crisis. Because a lot of the movement in Southern Baptist life in the last few years, we're seeing a lot of state Baptist conventions and churches starting to ask those questions without needing a crisis to be able to understand, what do I do next? And part of the challenges that they're struggling with is they don't understand this risk, which creates the first step of, we have to change that. We have to provide them that understanding of the risk, preferably before there's a crisis.
So, Greg, churches are wondering what they can do to make sure that sexual abuse never happens in their congregation and their ministry context. What are some general things that you start suggesting when you're in conversation with a church or when you're training a group of leaders?
Yeah. One of the first things that we have to do is almost like deconstruct this, like reverse engineers, like, see, this sexual abuse is not a new problem. It's 2022. It's like, why weren't we asking these questions 10, 15, 20 years ago? And what we've commonly found is most churches think they were doing it okay. Most churches think that they're fine related to this risk, but there's been so much commentary, there's been so much discussion about this, to where a lot of churches are now asking, what don't I know? What do I need to know so that I can address this risk? And so it's trying to overcome some of those obstacles, those misconceptions. And some of the most common misconceptions churches have been holding on to for the last 15 or 20 years are these two main misconceptions. Number one, that a criminal background check all by itself is going to solve my problems. And that's just not true. And the second one is, most ministry leaders, frankly, most child-serving organization leaders, don't truly understand what the risk is that's facing their children. So there's a need to help them understand there's 4 types of sexual abusers, but the ones that it's important to distinguish and contrast are 2, the abduction offender and the preferential offender. So once I can help a ministry leader understand that there's 2 different threats, then we can go in to help them understand, because I'm going to ask this question all the time, Todd, what are you doing at your church to protect children from sexual abuse? And I'll just let them tell me what that is. And it usually is going to be what we call the Christian list. It's going to be, well, we do criminal background checks. We have a child check-in system. We have a 6-month member rule. We have a 2-adult rule. We have video cameras in certain places and an officer that patrols the parking lot and the facility on Sundays. Okay. That list is not related to the risk. All the headlines we're getting, I don't care if it's Boy Scouts of America, I don't care if it's, whatever situation you're looking at, the risk is coming from the preferential offender. While the church is building beautiful fences to keep out the abduction offender, we're wide open on the preferential offender.
So let me make sure I'm understanding everything you're saying, and I want to do a follow-up question there. So I'm hearing what I heard you describe as when you ask a church what they're doing, you listed 4 or 5 things, and for many of us, that's a pretty well-prepared church. But you're saying that they're only prepared for that prepares them for one of the risk, and you mentioned the abduction offender versus the preferential offender. So tell us what is an abduction offender and what is a preferential offender?
Yeah, I'll do this just quickly summarizing. The abduction offender is somebody that may have no relationship to the child or the child's family, simply sees the opportunity, grabs the child, puts them in a white van, and goes. We'll get the alerts to our phones. We'll see it in the news. Usually the news story ends a few days later, and it's usually awful. Now, on the waterfront of child sexual abuse risk, where the studies are telling us 60 million sexual abuse survivors in the U.S., 1 out of 5 Americans, the abduction offender represents less than 10% of the problem. The preferential offender, by contrast, could be male or female, have an age-appropriate adult willing to have sex with him or her, but prefers a child as a sexual partner. And it's not just any child, it's usually a child within an age and sex of preference. Jerry Sandusky, preferential offender, boys ages 9 to 14. Larry Nassar, preferential offender, girls ages 10 to 15. Now, on the waterfront of child sexual abuse risk, the preferential offender represents 90% of the problem. Todd, that is our problem. Yeah. And you see, it's 2 different fences to keep out those 2 different risks. That list we just walked through, that's a beautiful fence to be able to keep out the abduction offender. In most of my churches, we're doing a terrific job at that. See, I haven't had a call in 30 years about a child being abducted from the 2nd grade class. Well. But see, the fence related to the preferential offender, we're wide open here, which is why if I went to the churches and asked, hey, what are you doing to protect your children from the preferential offender? The common answer before training is, I'm sorry, protect the what from the who?
Yeah.
And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you don't have a fence in place.
Well, you're introducing new language to a lot of us, our listeners, and to myself included. And so thank you for doing that, Greg. Thank you for your ministry and your experience and bringing it all to bear to help church leaders and prepare. So let's talk about that preferential offender a little bit. What are some characteristics or behaviors of this preferential? So we want churches to recognize this predator. What are some behaviors that might stand out about someone who is a preferential offender?
That is actually the right question, Todd, because a lot of people, the question they're asking, other than the way you put it, is, what does the preferential offender look like? And that's the challenge, because you see, a preferential offender has no visual profile. They look like you and me. Yep. But see, now we're having to move away from the natural way we do child protection, even of our own children, to try to understand, I can't spot this risk visually. I must recognize this risk behaviorally. And the behaviors are what we call the grooming process. So as a quick 1, 2, 3, 4, the grooming process involves somebody with a deviant sexual desire related to a child within an age and sex of preference. They're going to seek access. They're going to select a child. They're going to introduce nudity and sexual touch, and they're going to work to keep the victim quiet. Now, I just said that in 1, 2, 3, 4. That's not intuitive and needs a further discussion, which is why I'm glad the Kentucky Baptist Convention is prioritizing workshops so we can take deeper dives into the grooming process, and not just grooming generally, but how that grooming process might unfold in a ministry context.
So, Greg, you just said that the preferential offender isn't someone we can recognize by their look, and I think for a lot of us, instantly comes to mind an unshaven male that is lurking around and looking for access to children. But then the names that you mentioned, these are professional people, pillars in their community who were sexual offenders. So go back to your list of 4 just for another minute or so, and go a little bit further in describing these behaviors, just a little more, if you would, please.
You bet. And understand, the grooming process is going to be generally the same, but it's going to have some particulars depending on the age, sex, and circumstance of the child. So, for example, given how visual and easily stimulated by touch guys are wired to be, the grooming process when the target is a middle school or high school boy is oftentimes going to involve alcohol, tobacco, porn, weed. Grooming of a middle school or teenage girl is not going to usually involve alcohol, tobacco, porn, and weed. She's wired emotionally for relationship. The grooming process is usually going to be focused on developing a relationship that is then betrayed. And the underpinning of that is communication. So when you deconstruct that further, how does somebody interested in developing a relationship with a teenage girl going to communicate? I'm going to see texting, Snapchat, Instagram, the sending requests for nude photos. It's going to be a deterioration of communication into inappropriate. You see, that grooming process is consistently gaining access, selecting the target child, and then start to introduce nudity and sexual touch. But how that unfolds is a little different depending on who is the population you serve, and different yet again, say, for a 5-year-old. That grooming's not going to involve alcohol and Facebook. It's usually going to involve forms of playful touch unto isolation. So to help ministry leaders understand these are the ways in which we gather children, here's how certain grooming processes will unfold in those particular contexts. Knowing that allows me to now build the right fence to protect the children in that program.
I mean, you're describing a predator and someone who is hunting. So deer hunting is big in Kentucky. It's probably big in Texas. Deer hunters are very intentional about looking for what their hunt. You're describing a human being who is looking for their target and being very intentional about how they go at it.
And they're also doing it in a way right out in the open in many respects, because you see, we don't want, especially the more the Holy Spirit sanctifies me, the more tender, loving, forgiving, and grace-giving I get. Right. But see, that preferential offender is not parachuting into my world, throwing around elbows and attitudes to gain access to my child. It's a manipulation and deception. So much of this is happening out in the open without the normal people responsible for protecting children having any idea of what significance those behaviors have. That has to change.
Greg, can you tell about a time when someone from your training recognized a preferential offender, a predatory behavior, and was able to prevent abuse?
There actually is circumstances like that. Now, commonly people will ask, well, how many sexual abuse situations have you stopped through your programs? Like, well, that's a tricky question. It's like asking Homeland Security how many bombs didn't go off. Right. But see, when you ask it that way, a couple of the circumstances that have been encouraging to us, imagine doing a sexual abuse awareness training for a church staff. And we're trying to teach them, here's what the grooming process looks like. We not only want you to see those behaviors differently than you saw them before moving forward, but this is also one of those things that as you see them and things come to mind about circumstances in your past or your present, we've had a handful of churches that even during the course of a discussion about the grooming process, you had 6 or 7 people have that look, and they're all thinking about the same person. When the training is over, there's a gathering, and you have somebody being dismissed immediately on the spot, because all of that was describing the behavior of a particular person that was either a volunteer or on staff. And that's chilling to watch that happen in real time.
Wow. Greg, switching gears just a little bit. So when a leader becomes aware of a situation, an instance, or an allegation of sexual abuse, what are some principles that should guide that leader when that happens? A parent comes and says, this happened to my child, or a teenager comes, whatever it would be. What are some things that leader should be thinking about when that occurs?
Well, those are exactly the types of calls we get to help navigate ministry leaders through when there's ultimately a situation for which they don't have much of a manual to know exactly what to do, which, by the way, in working with the Kentucky Baptist Convention, trying to provide more framework. But all of those, when they call, are going to be very fact-driven, whether it's a peer-to-peer sexual abuse and a historical allegation, whether it's a staff member, volunteer, or simply somebody in their congregation. So answering a specific fact pattern is difficult, but some of the principles that are important is for people to understand it has to be victim-centric. Okay, and you must understand when in doubt, there's a report that needs to be made. There's communication that needs to be made, whether it's to the authorities. But usually people think, well, I've called the authorities and I'm done. It's like, no, you might not be done. Because as a shepherd of a flock, there may be additional communication unto that flock about someone who may have worn your name tag. There may be some communication necessary to others that are stakeholders or to the community, depending on the facts. But what I mean by a victim-centric approach is to have a ministry leader not in the moment, not when the adrenaline is going, but to think through in advance, what does it look like that if a situation arose, that I take all the next right steps which are best for that child who's been in harm's way? And that's not natural. Normally we get defensive and want to protect, and we want to, protect the image or the brand, but we just need to know we've got to come alongside that child and that child's family. We've got to be prepared to offer models of care. We've got to be compassionate. We've got to be able to communicate not in a defensive way. And so that's really difficult for a ministry leader to do, but it's so very critically important.
Difficult, and the training that you provide helps a leader be prepared. Instinctively, a leader wants to protect a flock and protect a church, and so it's not always a leader's instincts, as you said, to even think about this the way you're describing. Greg, can you tell of a time when you've seen a reported case of sexual abuse in a ministry context and it was handled well?
There is one that comes to mind, Todd. We had a situation, and it was actually in my ministry. And I'm in my 28th year of serving in student ministry at Christ Chapel Bible Church in Fort Worth, and had a circumstance where a girl in a small group had confided in her leader that she had been sexually abused by a female babysitter when she was younger. And of course, the leader immediately shaped the conversation into a, look, I want to pray for you, I want to come alongside you, but we've got to share that with the authorities. Now, that girl did everything to try to retract that information and try to make her not do that, but it didn't change that leader doing the hard thing. But then we had the conversation with that young lady and telling her, look, we have to make the report to the authority, but understand we can't know this and your parents not know this. And she said, you cannot tell my father. If he ever found out about this, I won't be his baby princess anymore.
Wow.
But we did that well. And if you can imagine, it was almost like, here we go. The dad, you can mess this up and it would be epically bad for this little girl, or you could do this well and rehabilitate her understanding of what it means to be a true father. And so we helped her share that. The father got up, he went over and hugged her and said, you will always be my princess. And it was one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen, which in that brokenness that she had experienced, because the ministry leadership did it right and then did the extra hard thing to be able to try to bring that to the family, it could have gone bad, but instead it was incredibly redemptive.
Greg, that's an incredible story. I want to ask you for an example of when it didn't go well, but can you think of 2 or 3 like common things that keep an abuse situation, reporting of it, and handling of it from going well? And what are some mistakes that we as leaders make when the instance comes to us?
We did a instructional piece for a seminary around a situation in West Texas where 5 leaders of a particular Christian school were arrested for failure to report with intent to conceal, which is a felony, by the way. Wow. And then another Christian school in that same community were arrested for failure to report with intent to conceal. And to try to help them understand in Christian education, what went wrong here? I mean, these people are being charged with felonies, and they're now unemployable in education. They didn't get up that morning deciding to commit felonies.
Sure.
What went wrong? And one of the things that we tried to help people understand in higher education is there is this tendency, not just in education, but in all ministry and child-serving organizations, that we believe that it's so very important to protect the brand, to protect the image and the reputation. And so what we do is when something goes wrong, we immediately try to fix it and make sure the brand is not threatened. And in Todd, that is the well-practiced, rehearsed way in which leaders manage certain things that come to their attention. And in 90% of the situations that arise, whether it's a building damage, a sewage leak, somebody has an affair, whatever, that way of handling it may be correct. But anything related to injury to a child, that natural effort to go into brand preservation or image protection actually gets you deeper in a ditch than you can imagine. And we use that as a case study. So it's to try to bring again to someone's attention prior to the allegation, you've got to be ready to put down your well-practiced way of responding to crisis and embrace a victim-centric way, communicating, knowing there might be some embarrassment, there might be some brand suffering, but in the long run, it's the healthiest thing for the child. The community wants authenticity and correct response, and in the long run, it's the exact right thing to do.
Well, that's everything you're saying is super helpful. So you're coming to Kentucky to do our church prepared training. Tell us about those trainings and why should folks attend?
Everybody needs to attend because this is critically important information for ministry leaders. Now, for those people who are already experienced with Ministry Safe online training and may be asking, well, how is this going to be different? It's going to be much different. In these workshops, they're going to be several hours, maybe 4 hours long, and it's not just going to cover awareness training. We're going to talk about prevention. We're going to talk about response, and we're going to talk about care. We're going to take a deep dive into that grooming process and how that grooming unfolds in ministry context. We're going to talk about how to develop an effective safety system and to be able to access the resources to do that. We're going to talk about models of care and pathways to healing that can be implemented at the church level rather than simply just sending people to outside clinicians. And we're going to finish by discussing, here's the reporting requirements in Kentucky. Here are the best practices. Here's ways that people can get into the ditch and give them materials to be able to navigate that well. So it's going to be a really, really valuable time that's going to be full of the information I think every ministry leader needs to have.
And Greg, we know obviously that pastors need this training, church staff folks as well. But who have you seen outside of those leadership position? Who have you seen in a church ministry context that when they get a hold of this kind of information, they really run with it and help their church? I'm thinking about like deacons, women's ministry leaders, church security people. What would you add to that?
I would add anybody who wears a name tag at the church. And yeah. I would actually go broader than that because one of the most common feedbacks, Todd, that we get is, I think I'm better at doing my job at the church, but this made me a better parent. Wow. And then we get the follow-up question of, can we take a version of this and just provide to our families? And I think that's huge feedback that it's correct because we're not only getting this information to protect children that are entrusted to our care, it makes us better at protecting the children that God has entrusted to us as parents.
So along with the training that you'll be providing here in the state, 4 locations in Kentucky, and registration is looking good for those trainings, there'll also be a handbook that'll be provided for each person in attendance, church prepared, addressing prevention, response, and care as it relates to sexual abuse. How will this handbook or manual be helpful for folks who attend?
I think it's going to be helpful because you can go to a comprehensive workshop and you can take notes as fast and furiously as you want. But the circumstance that you're going to be required to deal with, whether it's a historical allegation, whether it's trying to develop a model of care, whether it's trying to tighten up your safety system on peer-to-peer sexual abuse, having that handbook becomes a resource that when that situation does arrive, it's not a matter of going back to my notes or going to try to find some other video training that was captured. It provides guidance at your fingertips so that when we put together that leadership team at the church, it's something that everybody can use as guidance in circumstances that oftentimes don't have guidance or a manual. We're creating that which I know ministry leaders have needed for the last 22 years.
Greg, has it been your experience that when you provide this sort of training, that occasionally it does stir up that historical event that has to be addressed, that people either receiving the training or when a church begins to focus? Have you seen that happen?
I see it happen every time. Yeah. Every time. And see, a lot of churches will say to me at the beginning of a training like that, it's like, well, I'm glad we've never had this problem. It's like, I don't know that that's a fair statement, whether you've had that problem or not. But invariably, after a training like this, it's amazing how many people will come forward and even say, I didn't realize that was my experience. You just gave me language to describe what I endured. or somebody coming forward and saying, I now feel comfortable in my leadership to communicate this because you've now created a new environment that makes it safe for me to say so. So it's a really interesting environment post-training, and about the historical allegations and the peer-to-peer situations that most people may have just written off as that bully kid or sexual curiosity in play. It now has a new meaning once you've had some training, and it's a new meaning unto the church needing to do the next right thing.
Greg, I really believe that your training is going to help churches protect children and adults as well, for you being here. So we're looking forward to you coming. You provide resources through Ministry Safe. You reference Ministry Safe, and we'll hear more about that when you're here. Are there other resources that you'd recommend a church look into who wants to know more about protecting the folks in their congregation?
Well, in terms of the child piece, that's really my specialty, is to help people design and implement safety systems. But I want you to know there's a whole waterfront of need. There's a whole lot of need for care. Now, that's not necessarily my lane, but even in the workshop that we're going to be, providing to the Kentucky Baptists, is we're going to provide resources on care provided by other providers. But in terms of resources, in terms of risk to children, we know what those risks are and have created an entire resource library of those and want to make all of that available. But in terms of things outside our lane, I'm really interested in meeting additional people that can provide those things that we don't.
Greg, this platform is called Leadership Lessons. So tell us about an experience you had that shaped your approach to or understanding of leadership.
I think that one of the most important things that I've learned in leadership from doing the work that I do started in litigation, not in prevention. And it all started by representing a seminary student from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary that tried to report sexual abuse and was fired for it and was blamed for being the molester to try to keep him quiet. Now, that circumstance led to having to talk to the victims of abuse for which he was making reports, and it wound up in a 21 plaintiff litigation about a situation here in Fort Worth, Texas. But in working with sexual abuse victims, people who've been discounted, people who don't have a voice, and to try to message on their behalf, I just didn't anticipate how much conflict that I was going to experience trying to give a voice to those people who don't have voices. Now, even when we pivoted into the prevention world, it's still amazing how much conflict there is and that how much difficulty there is helping organizations do the next right thing. So the leadership principle that we learned pretty early on, me in particular, is trying to work in this realm is just hard. I'm going to be attacked by these people who don't want there to be a report made. I'm going to be attacked by these people once the report's made. Just there's a lot of people that have strong opinions in this emotionally charged realm, but to do the right thing invariably is a hard thing. And you just got to do the hard thing. And so learning that individually has really helped me be who I need to be to the pastors and the ministry leaders that call me for help, to give them encouragement that I will lead you into this hard thing, and it will be challenging and it will be difficult. But if you follow me through this and we do the right thing at the right time in the right way, you will see the redemptive value of this later, but not in the moment. And so it's just knowing that as much as people would love for me to help them find an easier, non-conflict, or a way that doesn't draw criticism, it's just invariably, this is going to be hard. Let's just go do the right thing.
It's just, that's excellent. So, Greg, how can folks reach you if they want to know more about you or the resources that you offer?
I'm easy to find, ministrysafe.com. And from there, any one of my staff can immediately get you to us.
Greg, thank you for your ministry to churches and their leaders. We look forward to having you in Kentucky, and thank you for taking time today to join Leadership Lessons.
Thank you, Todd.